You ever notice how the people everyone ignores are sometimes the only ones listening? The first thing Malcolm Price noticed wasn't the silence inside Whitmore Aviation's executive hangar. It was the sound hidden beneath it. Every failed ignition attempt echoed through the polished steel walls with a subtle hesitation that didn't belong in a state-of-the-art business jet worth tens of millions of dollars. Most people heard an engine refusing to start. Malcolm heard an engine trying to warn someone. He adjusted the worn backpack hanging from one shoulder as he stepped through the massive service entrance carrying a replacement hydraulic sensor ordered by a small maintenance contractor across town. His faded work jacket smelled faintly of machine oil, coffee, and the cinnamon cereal his 8-year-old son had insisted on eating before school that morning. The backpack wasn't filled with expensive tools. Half of the space belonged to Noah's homework folder, tucked safely beside a children's library book Malcolm still needed to return before the overdue fines grew larger than they should. The hangar itself looked less like a repair facility and more like a luxury showroom. Bright white lights reflected across spotless concrete floors. Private pilots, engineers, executives, and investors stood in small, anxious circles, speaking in voices carefully controlled but edged with growing concern. At the center of everything rested the Whitmore X-9, its sleek white fuselage gleaming beneath the overhead lights while technicians moved around it with increasingly frustrated expressions. Across the hangar, Evelyn Whitmore stood perfectly still. Her tailored ivory suit looked untouched despite the long morning. But the phone vibrating endlessly in her hand betrayed the pressure she refused to show. Every few seconds, another notification illuminated the screen. Board members, investors, aviation regulators. Someone whispered that the demonstration flight had already been delayed twice. Someone else quietly mentioned a contract worth nearly $1 billion. Evelyn didn't answer either of them. She simply watched another engineer climb down from the aircraft and shake his head. Malcolm slowed his steps without realizing it. The engine had just attempted another start. There it was again, that tiny interruption, that brief, uneven pulse buried beneath the roar of the auxiliary systems. His eyes narrowed instinctively. He wasn't trying to interfere. Old habits simply refused to disappear. Years spent diagnosing aircraft had taught him that machines almost always told the truth long before people were willing to hear it. He glanced toward the exhaust housing, then toward the maintenance panel left partially open beneath the left wing. Something didn't match. Not the temperature, not the smell. A faint trace of overheated metal drifted through the conditioned air, subtle enough that no one else seemed to notice. Malcolm quietly exhaled. "Don't start it again," he said, almost to himself. Unfortunately, someone heard him. Conversation stopped. Several engineers turned simultaneously. One technician let out a short laugh. Another folded his arms with obvious amusement. The silence that followed somehow felt louder than the engine ever had. Evelyn slowly lifted her eyes from her phone and looked directly at the unfamiliar mechanic standing near the service entrance, carrying a backpack that looked more appropriate for a father picking up his son after school than someone standing inside one of the country's most exclusive aviation facilities. For a long second, neither of them spoke. Then she started walking toward him. She stopped less than 6 feet away, her posture perfectly composed despite the pressure gathering around her. Up close, Evelyn Whitmore looked exactly like the magazines described her. Confident, precise, untouchable. But exhaustion had a way of revealing itself in places cameras never noticed. It lingered beneath her eyes and in the slight tension of the hand still wrapped around her phone. "Did you say something?" she asked. Her voice was calm enough that it never needed to become louder. Malcolm met her gaze without challenging it. "Yes, ma'am. What exactly did you say?" He glanced once toward the aircraft before answering. "I said you should not try starting that engine again." A faint smile appeared on the face of one of the senior engineers. It was not friendly. "And why would a delivery mechanic know more than my aviation team?" Another technician asked, earning a few quiet laughs from nearby executives. Malcolm shifted the backpack from one shoulder to the other. "I do not know more than anybody," he replied. "I only know what I heard." The engineer folded his arms. "You heard an engine that refuses to start." Malcolm slowly shook his head. "No, I heard one trying to protect itself." The laughter grew a little louder. Someone whispered that every repair contractor seemed to think they were an expert. Someone else muttered that confidence was cheap when there was nothing at stake. Evelyn never joined them. She simply studied him with the detached focus of someone evaluating a problem instead of a person. "What company are you with?" she asked. Malcolm named the small maintenance supplier that had sent him to deliver the replacement sensor. Recognition never crossed her face. The company was far too small to matter inside her world. Her attention drifted toward the envelope tucked beneath his arm. "You are not even here for this aircraft." "No, ma'am." "Then why comment?" Malcolm looked back at the jet. "Because if I am hearing what I think I am hearing, somebody could spend a fortune replacing the wrong parts." Another engineer stepped forward, irritation replacing amusement. "We have already inspected the compressor, fuel flow, ignition sequence, electrical systems, and software diagnostics." Malcolm nodded politely. "I believe you." "Then what exactly are you suggesting?" Malcolm remained quiet for several seconds. The silence unsettled people more than any argument could have. Finally, he answered, "I am suggesting the engine is not the first problem." Several puzzled looks spread through the group. Evelyn narrowed her eyes slightly. "Explain." Malcolm hesitated, not because he lacked an answer, but because experience had taught him that truth carried very little weight when it arrived wearing old work boots. "I cannot explain without opening 2 panels," he said. "Otherwise it is only a guess." One executive laughed openly this time. "Convenient." Another checked his expensive watch. "We do not have time for guessing." Evelyn looked toward the motionless aircraft, then back at Malcolm. Another message flashed across her phone. She read only the first line before locking the screen again. The demonstration flight was now less than 40 minutes away. Every minute the jet remained grounded, millions of dollars quietly drifted farther out of reach. She slipped the phone into her pocket, reached into her handbag, and pulled out a crisp $50 bill. Without changing her expression, she held it between 2 fingers before letting it flutter toward the polished concrete floor between them. The bill landed silently. "There," she said evenly. "You wanted attention. You have it." The $50 bill rested on the spotless concrete between them, untouched. Malcolm looked down for only a moment before lifting his eyes back to Evelyn. He did not bend to pick it up. He did not look embarrassed. He simply stood there with the same quiet expression that had unsettled her from the beginning. Around them, the engineers exchanged knowing smiles. One of the executives leaned toward another and whispered something that drew a restrained laugh. To them, the moment was already over. The stranger had been put back in his place. Evelyn watched him carefully. She had spent her career reading hesitation. People usually reacted within seconds. Some apologized. Some argued. Some became angry. Malcolm did none of those things. Instead, he adjusted the strap of his backpack and spoke in the same even voice. "Keep your money, ma'am." Another engineer smirked. "That is probably the smartest thing you have said all morning." Malcolm ignored him. His attention never left Evelyn. "I was not trying to sell advice." "Then why speak at all?" she asked. "Because airplanes do not care about titles." The sentence settled over the hangar with surprising weight. No one answered immediately. Evelyn tilted her head ever so slightly. "You believe everyone here is wrong?" "No, ma'am." "Then explain yourself." Malcolm looked toward the aircraft once more. "I think everyone here is looking exactly where experience tells them to look." One of the senior technicians folded his arms tighter. "Experience built this company." Malcolm nodded. "Yes, sir. And experience is valuable." He paused before adding quietly, "But sometimes the first thing you learn becomes the last thing you question." The technician took a step forward, clearly irritated now. "Enough philosophy. Either tell us the problem or leave." Malcolm inhaled slowly. The faint metallic smell drifted through the conditioned air again. He could hear another cooling relay click somewhere beneath the fuselage. Tiny sounds. Tiny clues. The kind most people overlooked once pressure entered the room. "There is a restriction somewhere that should not exist," he said. "The engine is reacting to something before combustion becomes the real issue." Several heads turned toward the aircraft again. A younger mechanic frowned, as if replaying the earlier startup attempts inside his memory. Evelyn noticed it. She noticed everything. Her phone vibrated once more. This time she silenced it without looking. "If I give you access," she asked, "how long before you know whether you are right?" Malcolm answered immediately. "Less than 5 minutes." Soft laughter returned. One investor shook his head. 5 minutes? Our engineering team has spent nearly 6 hours. Malcolm remained calm. "I did not say I could repair it in 5 minutes. I said I could tell you where the real problem begins." Evelyn studied him for another long second. Confidence usually sounded loud. His sounded strangely quiet. That difference made her hesitate. Then one of the board members spoke from behind her. "End this, Evelyn. We are wasting valuable time." She looked from the aircraft to Malcolm, then down at the untouched $50 bill still lying between them. Finally, she spoke without taking her eyes off him. "Let us make this interesting. If you are so certain, I will raise the stakes." The room seemed to shrink around Evelyn Whitmore as every conversation faded into expectation. She took one slow step forward, her heels echoing softly across the polished concrete floor until she stopped beside the untouched $50 bill. Without breaking eye contact, she spoke clearly enough for everyone in the hangar to hear. 5 minutes. You said you only need 5 minutes. Malcolm nodded once. Yes, ma'am. Then here are my terms. She folded her hands calmly in front of her. If you cannot identify the real problem within 5 minutes, security will escort you out, and you will never set foot inside another Whitmore aviation facility again. Several executives exchanged satisfied glances. One engineer smiled as though the outcome had already been decided. Evelyn continued before anyone else could speak. But if you are right, I will personally authorize a $5 million performance bonus to the maintenance division responsible for preventing today's failure. The entire hangar fell silent. Someone near the back nearly dropped a clipboard. The engineers looked at one another in disbelief. Malcolm's expression, however, never changed. The money should go to your people, he replied quietly. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. You have not even earned the opportunity to refuse it. Malcolm looked briefly toward the line of mechanics standing beside stacks of tool carts. Grease-stained uniforms. Long hours written across tired faces. Men and women who understood machines, but rarely appeared in company photographs. If I help, he said, they should be rewarded. They are the ones keeping these airplanes in the sky every day. One older mechanic slowly lowered his eyes, clearly surprised that a complete stranger had spoken for people he had never met. The younger technician who had laughed earlier no longer looked amused. Evelyn noticed every reaction. She also noticed something else. Malcolm had still not picked up the $50 bill. Not because he wanted to prove a point. He had simply forgotten it existed. That realization unsettled her far more than defiance would have. She had spent years negotiating with people motivated by money, power, prestige, or fear. Standing in front of her now was someone driven by something much quieter, and she could not immediately identify it. She glanced toward the aircraft again. Time continued slipping away. Investors stood near the observation windows, checking expensive watches. Her chief financial officer whispered that another delay might trigger cancellation penalties. The demonstration flight had become more than a schedule. It had become a countdown. Evelyn finally nodded toward the aircraft. Very well. 5 minutes begins the moment you touch that airplane. Malcolm removed his backpack carefully and placed it beside a nearby maintenance cart. Before unzipping it, he reached inside the front pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper decorated with bright blue crayon stars. It was a spelling test with a gold sticker reading excellent work. He smiled almost invisibly before placing it safely back inside. Then he closed the zipper with deliberate care. One executive frowned in confusion. Another mechanic quietly wondered why a father would carry school papers into an aircraft hangar. Malcolm walked toward the jet without hurry, stopping beneath the left wing. Instead of reaching for a wrench, he closed his eyes for 2 brief seconds. He listened. The cooling metal whispered softly through the quiet hangar. Then he opened his eyes, rested one hand lightly against the fuselage, and said almost under his breath, "Now tell me what everyone else missed." No one spoke as Malcolm slowly circled beneath the left wing. He did not rush, because rushing only made people hear what they expected instead of what was actually there. His fingertips moved lightly across the access panel, stopping near a row of fasteners that looked perfectly ordinary to everyone else. He leaned closer, inhaling carefully. There it was again. The faint scent of overheated alloy mixed with fuel vapor that should never have reached this part of the aircraft. He looked toward the lead engineer. Who opened this panel first? The engineer frowned. We all did. Multiple inspections. Malcolm nodded. And who closed it last? No one answered immediately. The silence itself became an answer. Evelyn folded her arms, watching every movement. Nearly 2 minutes had already disappeared. One board member quietly checked his watch, clearly expecting the stranger to fail. Malcolm crouched beside the panel and gently rested 2 fingers against one of the fittings. It felt slightly warmer than the surrounding metal even, though the engine had been shut down. Not much, just enough. He looked toward a nearby mechanic. "May I borrow your flashlight?" The young mechanic hesitated only briefly before handing it over. Malcolm thanked him with a small nod instead of reaching for the expensive diagnostic tablet sitting on the maintenance cart. He directed the narrow beam into a cramped opening behind the fuel distribution assembly. Dust particles floated through the light like tiny stars. Everything appeared normal until he shifted the angle by barely an inch. Then he saw it. A faint scratch running across the edge of a retaining bracket. Fresh, clean, completely out of place. Malcolm smiled almost imperceptibly. "Found you," he whispered. The nearby mechanic leaned forward. "Found what?" Malcolm carefully reached into the compartment and stopped before touching anything. "Do not move closer," he said calmly. "I want everyone to see this exactly as it is." Evelyn stepped forward without realizing she had done so. "What are you looking at?" Malcolm pointed with the flashlight instead of his finger. "That retaining bracket should be perfectly centered." Several engineers squinted toward the opening. One shrugged. Another shook his head. The lead engineer frowned harder. "It looks fine." Malcolm remained patient. "Look at the witness marks beside the bolt." The younger mechanic borrowed another flashlight and aimed it from a different angle. Suddenly his expression changed. "Wait." He stepped closer without crossing the safety line. "Those marks, they do not line up." The lead engineer moved beside him. His confident posture slowly disappeared as he stared into the compartment. "That is impossible," he murmured. Malcolm finally looked toward Evelyn. "Someone replaced this bracket recently." "It was serviced last week," one engineer replied. Malcolm nodded. "Then it was installed under tension." He gently rotated the flashlight again, revealing the hairline misalignment hidden in the shadows. Every startup transferred stress into the fuel control assembly before ignition stabilized. Your computers kept reporting secondary faults because they were reacting to the symptom, not the cause. No one laughed now. The only sound inside the hangar came from the distant ticking of cooling metal. Evelyn looked from the exposed bracket to Malcolm, then back to her engineering team. 3 minutes had passed, and for the first time that morning, every eye in the room was no longer searching the airplane. They were watching the quiet mechanic who had listened before he ever touched it. The lead engineer slowly reached toward the inspection panel, then stopped halfway, as if he no longer trusted his own assumptions. "Bring me the calibration gauge," he said quietly. Nobody moved at first. They were still trying to understand how a man carrying a backpack instead of a polished equipment case had uncovered what an entire engineering team had overlooked. Finally, the younger mechanic hurried toward the tool cabinet and returned with the precision gauge. The lead engineer measured the bracket twice. Then a third time. His face lost what little color remained. "He is right," he whispered. "The alignment is outside factory tolerance." The words spread across the hangar faster than any announcement could have. Investors stopped checking their phones. Administrative staff abandoned whispered conversations. Even the pilots waiting beside the demonstration aircraft stepped closer without crossing the safety boundary. Evelyn remained perfectly still, but inside, something had shifted. She had built an entire career believing preparation defeated uncertainty. Yet this quiet mechanic had walked into her world carrying nothing except careful observation and patience. "Can it be corrected?" she asked. The lead engineer looked toward Malcolm before answering, a gesture that surprised even himself. Malcolm nodded once. "Yes, ma'am. But the bracket is only part of the story." Several heads turned back toward him. "Explain," Evelyn said. Malcolm carefully accepted a clean inspection mirror from the younger mechanic and angled it beneath the fuel distribution assembly. The reflected image appeared upside down inside the small mirror. "See these polishing marks?" he asked. The engineers leaned in one after another. At first they saw nothing unusual. Then the youngest technician quietly inhaled. "Those marks should not be there." Malcolm smiled gently. "Exactly." He lowered the mirror. Someone forced the assembly into position after the bracket shifted. Instead of asking why the parts no longer aligned naturally, they adjusted everything around the problem. No accusation filled his voice, only observation. The lead engineer closed his eyes briefly. "That explains why every repair created another fault code." Malcolm nodded. The aircraft kept telling the truth. We simply asked the wrong question. Silence returned. It felt different now. Respect had quietly replaced skepticism. Evelyn glanced toward the countdown clock displayed on the far wall. Less than 20 minutes remained before the demonstration window expired. Normally, she would have demanded immediate action. Instead, she asked a different question. What would you do next? Malcolm answered without hesitation. Relieve the mechanical tension first. Then inspect every component that was adjusted afterward. If you only replace the bracket, the aircraft may start today, but the hidden stress will remain. One of the veteran mechanics slowly removed his cap. That is exactly how my father taught me to diagnose engines, he said softly. Fix the reason, not the symptom. Malcolm gave him a warm nod. Machines remember shortcuts. Evelyn looked down for a brief moment. Her eyes landed on the untouched $50 bill still resting exactly where it had fallen. It suddenly seemed strangely small against the polished floor. She bent down, picked it up, folded it once, and slipped it quietly back into her handbag. Then she looked at Malcolm with an expression no one in the company had seen before. It was not admiration. Not yet. It was something rarer. She was listening. The veteran mechanic wasted no time. He gathered 3 technicians with a simple nod, and together they carefully released the pressure surrounding the misaligned bracket exactly as Malcolm had described. Nobody questioned the sequence anymore. Nobody argued about procedure. The hangar had become strangely quiet, filled only with the soft clicking of tools, the occasional turn of a ratchet, and the distant hum of climate control echoing through the enormous building. Malcolm never tried to take command. He stood a few feet away, answering questions only when someone asked them. Every instruction was brief. Every explanation was clear. Half a turn. Stop there. Check the witness marks again. Do not force it. The younger mechanic looked up after loosening the final fastener. The tension is gone. Malcolm smiled. Now let the parts find where they wanted to be all along. The sentence puzzled one of the executives, but every mechanic in the room immediately understood. They watched as the bracket settled almost naturally into its proper position. The lead engineer slowly exhaled. I cannot believe we kept pulling everything into alignment instead of letting the assembly relax. Malcolm shrugged gently. Sometimes we work so hard solving a problem that we accidentally become part of it. Evelyn heard every word. She found herself studying him instead of the aircraft. There was no pride in his face. No satisfaction at proving anyone wrong. Only relief that the airplane finally had a chance to tell the truth. Her phone vibrated once again. She looked down at the screen. The board wanted another update. Investors were asking whether the demonstration should be canceled. She locked the screen without replying. For the first time all morning, she trusted silence more than promises. The lead engineer carefully secured the corrected assembly before stepping back. Ready for another ignition sequence, he announced. Every pair of eyes turned toward Evelyn. Company policy required her authorization before any engine test. She looked toward Malcolm. Should we proceed? It was a simple question, but everyone recognized what had changed. Less than an hour earlier, she had treated him as an interruption. Now she was asking for his judgment. Malcolm did not answer immediately. He walked one slow circle around the aircraft, stopping once beneath the left wing, then near the nose, listening to the quiet machine as though it were finishing a conversation. Finally he nodded. Yes, ma'am. I believe it is ready. The lead engineer climbed into the cockpit while ground crew moved into position. Safety checks were completed one by one. The signal was given. A low electrical whine filled the hangar as the startup sequence began. Several executives unconsciously held their breath. The compressor started turning. Smoothly this time. Fuel pressure climbed steadily across the instrument display. 1 second passed. Then another. The ignition engaged with a deep, controlled rumble that rolled across the polished floor before rising into the unmistakable roar of a healthy turbine. The aircraft did not hesitate. It did not stumble. It came alive with calm, confident power. Nobody spoke. They simply stood there, watching the engine stabilize exactly as it had been designed to do. The younger mechanic laughed first. The veteran mechanic removed his cap and shook his head in quiet disbelief. The lead engineer looked through the cockpit window toward Malcolm and gave him a slow, respectful nod. Evelyn never looked at the airplane. Her eyes remained fixed on the father standing beside his worn backpack, wondering how someone the world had overlooked could carry so much quiet wisdom without ever needing to announce it. The applause came slowly at first. One pair of hands, then another. Within seconds, the entire hangar echoed with genuine respect instead of polite corporate approval. It was not applause for a perfect engine. It was applause for the quiet certainty that had restored everyone's confidence. Malcolm lowered his head slightly, almost embarrassed by the attention. He had never learned how to stand comfortably inside a spotlight. His phone vibrated inside the front pocket of his worn jacket. He glanced at the screen and smiled. A message from Noah's elementary school read, "Do not forget family science night begins at 6:30 this evening." Malcolm slipped the phone away as carefully as if it contained something priceless. Evelyn noticed the smile. It was different from the expressions she usually saw after successful negotiations or profitable contracts. It carried no victory, only gratitude. She walked toward him while the engineers continued reviewing engine data. "Mr. Price," she said quietly. He turned. "Yes, ma'am. The aircraft is operational because of you." Malcolm shook his head. "No, ma'am. The aircraft is operational because your mechanics cared enough to look again." Several members of the maintenance crew overheard him. The younger technician looked away, hiding an unexpected grin. The veteran mechanic folded his arms and nodded almost imperceptibly. Years of difficult work had rarely earned recognition from executives standing 20 feet away. Malcolm had offered it without being asked. Evelyn studied him for another long moment. "You could have taken credit. Credit does not keep airplanes flying. Money usually motivates people." Malcolm glanced toward his backpack resting beside the maintenance cart. "Money pays the bills." He smiled faintly. "Purpose gets you out of bed before sunrise." Before Evelyn could respond, the lead engineer approached carrying a printed engine report. "Every system is reading inside factory specifications," he said. "Better than yesterday, actually." He hesitated before extending his hand toward Malcolm. "I owe you an apology. We dismissed you before we ever listened." Malcolm accepted the handshake warmly. "We all miss things sometimes. Not like this." The engineer gave a quiet laugh. "You probably saved us weeks of replacing parts we did not need." Malcolm shrugged gently. "You would have found it eventually." The veteran mechanic smiled. "Maybe, but not before spending a small fortune." Laughter spread naturally through the group, lighter now than it had been all morning. Evelyn looked around the hangar. The tension that had controlled the building for hours had disappeared. People were talking to one another again instead of talking past one another. She realized something that surprised her. Malcolm had repaired more than an aircraft. He had quietly changed the atmosphere of an entire team simply by refusing to embarrass anyone. Her assistant hurried across the floor holding a tablet. "Miss Whitmore, the investors are asking whether the demonstration flight is still scheduled." Evelyn accepted the tablet without looking at it. "Tell them the demonstration will proceed on time." The assistant nodded and hurried away. Malcolm picked up his backpack and slipped one shoulder through the strap. "If everything is finished here, I should probably deliver the part one originally came for." Evelyn blinked. For a second, she had forgotten he had never come to repair her aircraft at all. As he started walking toward the service entrance, she called after him. "Mr. Price." He stopped and turned. "Would you give me 5 more minutes? There is something I need to ask before you leave." Malcolm stopped beside the service entrance, one hand resting lightly on the strap of his backpack. The roaring engine behind him had already settled into a smooth idle, yet he somehow seemed more interested in getting across town before afternoon traffic than in celebrating what had just happened. He turned back toward Evelyn with the same calm expression he had worn all day. "You asked for 5 minutes, ma'am." She walked across the polished floor until only a few feet separated them. Around them, the hangar had returned to life. Mechanics exchanged ideas. Pilots reviewed flight plans. Executives answered phones with relieved smiles instead of anxious whispers. The building had not changed. The people inside it had. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "This morning I offered you $50 because I assumed that was what would matter most." Malcolm said nothing. "I was wrong." She reached into her handbag and removed a neatly folded envelope. "Inside is the authorization for the $5 million bonus I promised." Malcolm accepted the envelope without opening it. "Thank you. There is one condition." He looked up. "It cannot be deposited into your account." Several executives nearby looked confused. Evelyn continued. "You said the maintenance team earned it. I have already instructed accounting to divide every dollar among the mechanics, technicians, inspectors, and support staff who kept this fleet operating every day, including the overnight crews that rarely receive recognition. Absolute silence followed. Then the veteran mechanic slowly removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes before quietly looking away. The younger technician stared at Evelyn as though he had misheard her. The lead engineer lowered his head for a brief second, overwhelmed by something far more meaningful than a financial reward. Malcolm smiled. It was the same quiet smile he had shown when reading Noah's school message. That was the right decision, he said softly. Evelyn reached into the envelope once more and removed a simple white business card with her direct phone number written by hand across the back. This part is for you. Malcolm accepted it carefully. Whitmore Aviation needs people who can hear what everyone else misses. I would like to offer you a position as senior technical advisor. You choose your schedule. You choose your projects. Your son comes first. If there is a school event, you leave. If he needs you, you go. Airplanes can wait. Childhood cannot. Malcolm looked at the card without speaking. The offer was generous beyond anything he had imagined. Yet his first thought was not about salary or title. It was about the science fair beginning at 6:30 that evening. He slipped the card into the same backpack pocket that held Noah's spelling test. May I think about it? He asked. Evelyn smiled for the first time that day. It was small, genuine, and completely free of performance. I was hoping you would. Malcolm extended his hand. She accepted it. Neither of them rushed the moment. It was simply two people meeting each other without assumptions. As Malcolm walked toward the parking lot, the afternoon sunlight poured through the open hangar doors, stretching his shadow across the concrete. Behind him, the jet stood ready for flight. Ahead of him waited a little boy expecting his father to arrive on time. Evelyn watched until he disappeared from view, then quietly whispered to herself. The engine was never the most important thing he repaired today. And somewhere beyond the runways, a father drove home carrying nothing louder than quiet dignity, leaving behind a lesson that no balance sheet could ever measure, because kindness does not ask to be noticed. It simply changes everything around it.